right, I think we're going. All right. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right. So here we go. So what is psychology? What is it all about? Why do we look at it from why have we become more and more interested in culture and its influence on behavior and mental processes is because we're finding that culture is probably a primary driver into the reasons we do what we do. Okay. So, hi. No, you're okay. Um, we're just getting into a little introduction of what psychology is. So, okay. So, um, let's go through and we'll go through the original definitions and then kind of how we contemporarily define psychology. So when we look at the term psychology, it comes from the Greek word meaning mind. Okay, now what is the mind thing? The mind is what gives us our kind of conscious reality of our knowledge of our past, our future. That thing that allows us to reflect and perceive the world. And it's kind of that kind of nebulous kind of thing that gives us our reality. Okay. But the word mind, the term psyche in Greek actually has a more original meaning. Its original meaning of mind is actually breath, because what the Greeks believed is that when we took our first breath, we breathed in our soul or our mind, and then when we took our last breath, we breathed out our soul and mind. Okay. The reason this is kind of important is, at least from a Western perspective, this brings up one of the first philosophical questions that psychology has tried to take on as well, known as the mind-body problem. Okay. The mind-body problem, as we will see, is your mind separate from your physical body, or are they one and the same? Okay. And we'll get into this because that debate still has not been settled. Even with our modern medical, neurological measurement devices and whatnot, and this idea that the brain is the seat of the mind, even with this growing evidence, there's a growing argument that there still can be a separation between one's mind and one's body. Okay. So we'll get into that as we move forward. Logos, of course, is knowledge or study of, so it's a knowledge or study of the mind. Okay. Um, the kind of, again, I talked about a construct definition. Okay, so construct definition is a definition that we all can use that provides kind of some solid grounding for what we're going to investigate. Okay, so kind of our contemporary, more modern definition of psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Okay. The first word that you see that's highlighted and underlined is scientific. Okay. This means that we use some type of standardized procedures, some type of statistical or mathematical process that can provide evidence for or against a given concept, but its main purpose is so that it can be replicated. Okay. So you'll hear throughout a lot of lectures in this class that I'll say new studies have shown, but I'm waiting for replications of those studies to see if they hold. Okay. The reason we do that is we want to know if a study shows something in a certain area, does it show it everywhere? Okay. If not, then it's something about that context of that study, probably not something that is common in human behavior and mental processes. So we'll get to that. And then the other part is the scientific study of behavior. Behavior are those things that you can observe. Okay. So the example here, you can observe someone crying. Okay. You can observe reaction time. You can you can observe how a person reacts to a given stimulus in the environment. Okay, so those are all things that you can have direct observation of. Okay. When we talk about mental processes, we talk about those things that, as the researcher or the investigator, we don't have direct access to or covert. We have covert access, meaning that in order for me to know what your memory is, I have to go through you. I can't directly observe it. Okay. Now, in the modern times of social media and stuff, maybe we can observe it, but technically or theoretically, we can't have direct observation of that. Certain types of feelings and emotions, um, the way that you problem solve to gain an understanding of something is something I don't have direct access to. Okay. All right, and two other points on this is that psychology is both a science and a profession. So most individuals who go into psychology are known as what's called clinical or counseling psychologists. In fact, in the American Psychological Association, I think 52% are clinical counseling. Okay, meaning that they use both the methods, the scientific methods, and the knowledge of behavior and mental processes to try and improve people's lives or some mental condition. Okay. And then the science part is there are psychologists who just do pure research to just understand human behavior, cognition, social interaction. They just do research to do research and understand the human condition. Okay. There has been some people suggest that psychology should be called the study of the brain. Um, and it's become and largely because the brain is showing to have a, a lot of association with our behavior and mental processes, right? And we'll get to a lot of these throughout the class. And indeed, my dissertation was on social aspects of life, but I still had to write a chapter on the neurological aspects of my dissertation was loneliness and identity. And I had to have a chapter that was just dedicated to the biological processes of what happens when someone is lonely or when someone's thinking about their identity. Okay. So there is this movement to put the brain as kind of the seat of the mind. However, as again, when we go through these cultural aspects of the class and what we call idiosyncratic um, processes, the brain doesn't always tell us everything. Okay. At least given the technologies we have and whatnot, the brain isn't always the best predictor of behavior. Okay. All right. So that's kind of the definition. And again, it's this modern one that we'll kind of use to kind of as a guiding definition throughout the class. All right. So if that's the definition, what are kind of the goals that we have? Okay. And this is a circular, ever-changing thing, but usually we start with description. Okay. Description is just being able to name and classify something. Okay. So if we take a classical, but a something that most people tend to experience in their life is periods where your eating habits aren't the same, your sleeping habits aren't the same, you have a reduced mood, you have reduced motivation, you have little interest in things like social relationships and those kinds of things, and you just have this general feeling of doom. Okay. So someone investigating these very common symptoms or things people are experiencing, because it's a reduced mood and everything, maybe we will label this depression. Okay. So we've labeled it and we've described it. Okay. And we have found that there's certain sets of the population that experience it for long periods of time. Most only experience for about 90 days. But now we have a description of something that is common that people commonly experience. Okay. So we have a description of something. So now we want to understand it. What causes it to occur? Okay. And this is really where we start to use a model known as the biopsychosocial model. Okay. We start with biological processes. So we notice that with a good number of people who are experiencing these symptoms, as we'll call them, respond to something called an SSRI, which is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which means what it does is it makes it so there's more serotonin available in the brain. So a theory, biological theory that comes out of that is depression is caused by low serotonin levels. Okay. Um, we can also look at genetics and look at things like twin studies and see that with identical twins, if one twin has depression, it's the probability of the other twin getting depression is high as well. So there's potential genetic components. Okay. And then we look at psychological processes. So, what is driving a lot of the mood and low motivation? Okay. And we find that a very common psychological aspect of this is something known as rumination. Okay. Where an individual has a very poor self-image of themselves. And so they go through the day looking for evidence of their worthlessness and discount information about their worthiness, if that makes sense. And then they continue getting in kind of this playback track about they're just not a good person. Okay. And that's very common.
Could that be an effect of trauma?
It can be, and that's one other potential causal factor when we get into social aspects, right? Because we know a lot of people who have depression has to do a lot with loss, especially a significant one, the results of trauma. You probably have heard of uh, post, oh my goodness, postpartum depression. So that's in a sense a trauma, if you want to think of it that way. And so all of those types of things are potential aspects. So that social aspect of lived experience, right, can have a large effect as well. Okay. So now that we know the causal things as of right now, okay, as what we can observe, we go to prediction. So when is it that a person is most likely to experience depression? Okay. Well, obviously trauma, right? We can also look at people who have family histories of depression and look at when the family members tended to start experiencing it and look at it from that direction, right? So we can start to forecast when it's most likely individuals will contract it. And then, of course, the control in this aspect is how can we help the person cope or deal with their depression? How can we help them heal as a process? Okay, so this is doing treatments. The biological treatment, which is medication, or or even there's a lot of homeopathic things that individuals do. The psychological, dealing with the thought processes and helping the person realign their thought processes, and then the behavioral aspects and the social aspects. Okay. And so then we hope then again that person then going back to description doesn't go through that cycle again. Okay. So that's kind of the goals. And no matter what we're investigating, we tend to use these processes to understand um, things. Now, I should note that for most topics in psychology, we're just around description and understanding. Okay. Psychology is a very young field. We're like 200 years old. That's about it. Okay. As a scientific study. And so a lot of what we know is really kind of at that description understanding phase of development. So, all right, so those are the goals. Let's take care of some of the three big myths of psychology. One, psychology is all about mental health. Well, I did use a mental health example. Believe it or not, we're not all about mental health or mental illness. However, this myth is very understandable because of the amount of psychologists who do mental health and mental illness services. So it's an understandable myth, but we go well beyond just talking about disorders and the misery of life. Okay. Myth number two, psychology is not a science. And again, this is an understandable myth because there's a lot of individuals who um, write on topics of psychology that may not be actual trained psychologists. Okay. And so this myth is understandable because everybody really, I hope you're interested in why we behave the way we do and why we think the way we think. So psychologists are not the ones that have this area all to ourselves, but it can lead a lot of people to think, well, that's psychology. It's just that fluffy stuff that I read on the internet once in a while. So. But what we talk about in academic and what we'll talk about in this class will always have some type of scientific foundation. Okay. And the last one, and my most favorite, psychologists can read minds. Believe it or not, a trained psychologist, a PhD, let's even take someone who's trained to understand someone's mental health condition. Okay. So let's take a PhD level psychologist or a medical degreed psychiatrist. They cannot predict someone's behavior or predict what someone's thinking any better than a person who spends most of their time alone. Okay. Prediction rates, just like everyone else, is around 45 to 50%. That's pretty much the population rate. So, no, we can't read your mind, but this is some good advice. If you have someone go to a therapist, or if you go to a therapist and they immediately say they can understand everything about you, and within a 50-minute interview, they know your problem, your diagnosis, and everything else, leave and ask for a refund because they don't. Okay. But I will admit, for those who are going into counseling and social work and whatnot, this is really fun to mess with people. When you say, I'm going to go be a counselor, everyone instantly goes, oh, you're analyzing me. If they annoy you, say, yes, I am, because then they won't talk to you anymore. It's kind of nice. It's a nice kind of thing. I'm just kidding, kind of. Okay. So those are kind of some of the myths and whatnot and misconceptions that a lot of people have about what we're trying to do within at least the field. Let's go into some of those philosophies because I think these philosophies are important because even though we're going to talk to them kind of from their Western roots, literally every society that we've studied have asked these questions, have been pondered what they are. In a lot of theological or in a lot of naturalistic or philosophical, we find some of the solutions. In fact, at the end of this, I will present an awesome person's perspective on these problems. Okay. So but we'll kind of take it from that Western route and whatnot, but you'll see some very integral parts that kind of go across culture that the way they analyze it. Okay. The first question that has that has been asked is what is known as the nature versus nurture question. Okay. Nature is that are we born with our personality, our intellectual capacity, our way of being, our way of emoting? Are we born with that? Is it inherited? Or is who we are as people due to nurture or lived experience. Okay. The two people that are kind of originate this, and I am going to warn everybody, if you're interested in these topics, I'm giving the very, very simple version of these. Okay. So if these interest you, kind of go and do a little bit more reading because I'm giving the simple, like, subtext part of this. All right. So the two people at least Greek, where Greek society started, which led to modern philosophy in the Western world, were Plato and Aristotle. Okay, Plato and Aristotle were students of a philosopher known as Socrates. Okay, which Socrates came up with the Socratic method. If you're going to go into counseling, if you're going to go be an attorney, you'll spend a lot of time, especially in graduate school, becoming an attorney using the Socratic method. Okay, and literally, there's a lot of attorneys I've talked to. They say they sat in front of a professor, and it was this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for hours. Okay, because what the Socratic method is that you keep questioning the person in front of you, and they keep questioning you until you both come to an ultimate truth, right? So in law, when what you're trying to do through your rhetoric is prove whether someone is guilty or innocent. Okay. And so you're using that back and forth and questioning to kind of come to a conclusion, is this person guilty or innocent? Okay. In counseling, you're trying to really get to the deep rooted reason why a person is experiencing what they're experiencing. Okay. And not just leave it at kind of that surface level. Okay. But anyway, so Socrates was known for this. His two students were Plato and Aristotle. When Socrates died, Plato and Aristotle both thought that they would inherit his school, but the school ended up going to Plato instead of Aristotle, which Aristotle said, well, imagine a Greek guy giving the finger and saying, I'm out of here, I'm done with this, and he takes off. But he doesn't go establish a school right away. He actually spends years observing the natural world. He is credited as kind of being the first natural scientist. In fact, he's the one that you see the charts of feline and I don't know, plant and those. He's the one that started those phenocharts. Okay. And he observed the world before going and establishing his school. Okay. Plato, on the other hand, stayed within the aristocracy and everything within the community that Socrates came from. And they're going to note two different things about the human condition. Plato is going to note that a person tends to stay within the area that they're born. So if they're born into a merchant family, they become a merchant. If they're born into a labor family, they become a laborer or a farmer or a king or a queen. Okay. And so he's going to come to the belief that everything is inherited through our bloodline. Okay. And this is what's going to really hold the ideas of bloodlines with kings and queens through the dark ages and all of those things is this idea that it's your blood that determines who you are. Okay. And so he's going to take a nature point of view. He's going to say that we are born into the hand that is given to us and that we can't go beyond that. Okay. And this also established, if you hear the idea of caste societies, where you can't go outside some rigid place of where you belong. Okay. So that's what Plato's going to argue is he's going to argue that we inherit through bloodline today. In modern times, we would say our genetics, right? Aristotle, on the other hand, because he kind of went and explored the world first, is going to come up with a different conclusion by looking at plants and animals. Okay. And he's going to note that if a plant doesn't get the right amount of sunlight, the right amount of water, the right kind of soil nutrients, it fails to survive. Okay. And he's going to come to the conclusion that it is the environment that a person is in that determines your health and well-being and who you are. And so he's going to argue for a much more nurturing end rather than an inherited end. And he's going to argue what's important. So if you want to put it in more modern terms, if you really strongly believe in education, you're more on that nurture end. If you believe more on the genetic ends and that we inherit things, you're more on the nature end. Okay. Now, of course, now why is this a debate still today? Because we're finding more and more evidence for the nature end of things with brain processes, genetics, all of these kinds of things, is because there are still things we cannot explain purely through genetics. Okay. One example is your personality. Okay. One of the ways we measure how much is due to genetics versus environment is what's called the genetic quotient. Okay, the genetic quotient using different study methods gives you a percentage of how much is due to genetics and how much is due to environment. Okay, and so when we study things like personality and personality traits like introversion, extroversion, openness, closeness, those kinds of things, depended on the study you read, the genetic quotient is anywhere between 20 to about 65%. Okay. Meaning that studies that study these things can't come to any agreement about how much genetics versus the environment contributes to who we are as individuals. So today we use more of an interactionist approach and say it's a combination of both. And we will get into different areas of evidence that actually suggest that. One big topic, for example, among Native American populations is historical trauma. Okay. There's growing evidence that there is genetic markers that has your historical trauma or your history on it. Okay. And so there is probably a good genetic component other than just the stories and the inherited trauma you get from your family. Okay. So we'll talk about how these interact and how other societies have dealt with it and deal with it. Okay. The second problem, which is closely related, is what's known as the mind-body problem. And we alluded to this when we went through the definition. Okay. Is your mind separate? This is what's called dualism from your body. Or is your mind and body one and the same? This is what's called mononistic approach or materialism. Okay, meaning that you're just a material thing. You're just that's what you are. Okay. And again, when we look at two philosophers who kind of took this question on, we have Descartes and John Locke. Okay. Descartes, uh, he's a fascinating person. If you ever want to read about a philosopher and go, wow, that's kind of cool. He's a very smart, intelligent person. But he was commissioned by what's known today as a special interest group. Back then it was known as the Roman Catholic religion, to determine this question, whether our mind and body are the same or different. And of course, because he knew what would happen if he said they were the same, he developed a theory that they are separate. Okay. And the classic story that comes out of this is he was actually walking in some German gardens. Okay. And these German gardens had these statues in it that along the walkway using hydraulics, if you stepped on a brick, it would make the statue move through hydraulics. Okay. And so this is what he felt was his evidence he needed to show that the mind and the body are two separate things, is that he said for a physical object to move, it has to have something that acts upon it. It can't act within its own self. Okay. So he argued that the mind by necessity, by mechanical necessity, has to be separate from the body. Okay. So that's the original argument for that. John Locke is an interesting person because if Thomas Jefferson were to submit the Declaration of Independence to my class, I would actually have to fail him for plagiarism. Okay. Because the majority of the Declaration of Independence was actually written by John Locke in his Treatise of Government. Okay. Where he said that human beings are all born equal with the same rights. I can't remember how the Declaration of Independence put it, but we all are born equal with the same rights, the same um, freedoms. Um, and the reason why we are all born the same is that we are all born with blank slates. Okay. If we put it in modern terms, we're all born with blank hard drives. Okay. For which experience writes upon. So for John Locke, because he wanted to show that every human has the same rights, had to make an argument that the mind and the body are the same thing. So he did a materialistic view, but he said that it's experience that determines that what happens. Okay. So, um, so nothing can be predetermined by a thing we call the mind, and we all have to be born with blank slates. Okay. Now, with these two philosophies, where are we today? While you could probably guess that, again, in our modern age of brain imaging and brain studies, people are leaning more towards the materialistic view of human beings. Um, but there are still some strong arguments that the mind and the body are two separate entities from at least a scientific perspective. And it comes out of the study and the philosophy of consciousness. Okay. Consciousness is our ability to realize that we're here, right? Um, and where does consciousness come from? Okay. And this is a simple kind of way to put it that the mind and body people say is yes, we can identify the neural paths that give a way to images, okay, that give a way to sound, okay, but no one has located your video screen and your speakers. No one knows how that electricity in your brain gives us our experience, how the brain develops these images that we see and these sounds that we hear. Okay. That's something that the monolithic or materialistic people have not been able to solve yet. And so there's this additional argument that there must be some other entity besides just neural processes. The brain can be maybe considered your CPU, the computer operating system, but no one knows who is actually doing the viewing, if that makes sense. Okay, it's kind of a funky thing to think about for those who partake in mind-altering things. Think about that sometime. Anyways, just kidding. All right, so that's the other thing that we've taken on um, as far as studies, and again, it gets complicated. All right, and then the last couple things that we'll get to today. Let's see what time it is. We have a few more minutes, I think. Is the nature of man versus, and then the way we understand the world. Okay. The nature of man, the basic question behind this one is human beings born selfish, destructive, egocentric, only out for themselves? Or are human beings born good, helpful, wanting to care for others? Okay. And again, we'll go to two individuals, Hobbes and Rousseau, for this one. Hobbes, they're both going to look at nature because at this time there was a strong belief that humans come from nature, we're part of nature, and therefore what happens in nature is the same within the human experience. Okay. And Hobbes is going to look at the world and he's going to see complete destructions. He's going to say hurricanes destroying places, volcanoes, thunderstorms, doing all this destructions and wildfires and things, and he's going to see a world in chaos and out of control. And so he's going to say, because the world is destructive, human beings are destructive by nature. Okay. Rousseau's going to look at nature a little bit different. He's going to see that, for example, wildfires give way to better vegetation. He's going to see volcanoes creates land. He's going to see that hurricanes kind of reset weather patterns that have been extreme. He's going to see that the predator kills the prey. The predator defecates and fertilizes a land that allows the prey to eat. Okay, and so he's going to see this circular thing about nature, about how nature continually helps each other and helps itself. And so he's going to say that the nature of man is actually good, that we're more altruistic than we are destructive. Okay. Now, again, where are we on this today? And we'll talk a lot about culture on this. Is Hobbes' theory is going to have a huge influence on the American and English correction system and law enforcement system and legal system. Because what Hobbes is basically saying is that the job of government is to temper man's or human beings' natural aggressive tendencies, to keep society civil, that people left to their own accord will become destructive and hurtful. And so the job of law enforcement, the job of the legal system is to control our natural impulse towards aggression. Okay. If we look at the Icelandic areas, we look at places like Switzerland, Denmark, those kinds of places, they're going to take on Rousseau's version of human nature. Okay. And what they're going to believe is that when a person does something wrong, it's not because that's what they naturally are meant to do. They're deviating from nature, and that society's job is to bring those individuals back into their natural natured state. Okay. And so when you look at a correction system here in the United States, when you look at the correction system here in the United States, it's all about control and isolating those evil people away, punishment, punishing them for doing what's wrong. Okay. In places, for example, in Denmark, going to prison is kind of like going to a staycation at a really nice hotel. The rooms are not jail cells. They have comfortable beds, TVs. They have access to therapists, gyms. Their rooms aren't locked. Now, I'm not saying everyone. There's a subpopulation they have to isolate, but I'm trying to draw the difference here. Is what their correction system is trying to get that person to come back to their human natural state, and punishment does not help that way. Punishment to them pushes people more away from their natural state instead of closer. Okay. So you might ask from an American perspective, well, let's talk about recidivism rate. Because most of the time when I present this, I ask, who do you think has the highest recidivism rate? And a lot of people go, well, Denmark does, because you get to go live in this nice, comfortable place with all of these services and everything. But it's actually the opposite. Okay. When we talk about recidivism, one of the main measures of recidivism is the probability that, yeah, recidivism is the probability of ending up back into prison after the first time you were in prison. Okay. So here in the United States, a first time inmate has a 60% probability of re-offending and going back to prison. Okay. In Denmark, it's 8%. Okay. And so So the reason why I bring this up is here we have a cultural difference, right? Based upon the philosophy of what a society or a culture thinks about the humans that exist there. And again, here in the United States and especially Britain, England, those areas, it's very much a Hobbesian approach that we have to temper people's natural tendency to be awful people. Other cultures believe that no, what we need to do is help bring them back to who they are as human beings. Okay. So two different cultural approaches and two completely different outcomes. Okay. So does that make sense on recidivism? Okay. 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 So, and we'll talk more about that as we move along, um, because it tends to be a pretty interesting topic to compare to other societies and cultures. Okay. And then the last one is the argument of structuralism versus functionalism. Okay. And this comes out from probably the two individuals that are kind of the fathers of modern scientific psychology. Wilhelm Wundt is known as the father of scientific psychology overall. There's a lot of argument behind this, but he's credited with this because he um, uh, developed one of the first labs to investigate psychological processes in Germany. Okay, so he's kind of given the credit for being the father of psychology. William James is one of the first individuals here in the United States to start lecturing on topics of psychology. Okay. And in fact, he wrote the first two kind of textbooks in psychology. I can't remember their names right now, but if you do go to graduate school in psychology, you'll have the loveliness of ingesting those two volumes. Just to let you know, it's still used today. Um, but these two individuals are going to have two different views of how we should investigate. Okay. James is going to have a very American approach. Okay. And Wilhelm Wundt is going to have a very kind of more German approach. Okay. What Wilhelm Wundt is going to argue is that if we know the structures of the mind, we know how the mind operates. We know how it works. We've explained it. Okay. So we're going to go over one theory known as Freudian psychoanalysis, which argues that the mind is made up of three components: the id, the ego, the superego. That's a structuralist approach. Okay. In modern terms, if you believe that understanding that the amygdala gives a way to emotional processes, and that's enough to explain emotional processes, you're a structuralist. Okay. Because you feel that that answers the questions of emotions. Right. And that is very much, if you look at more European types of psychologies and stuff like that, it's very much that way. Well, okay. However, James, if you think about the American way of doing things, we often want to know how things work. We want to know how we can take something and do something with it, right? And so he's going to come up with a what's known as a functionalist approach. Okay. He's going to go, I don't care if the amygdala activates while you have the emotion of fear. I want to know why you have fear. I want to know what its purpose is. I want to know when and where we're going to experience it. Okay. And that's what's known as functionalism, is when you're more interested in the why instead of the what. Okay. And again, this is another one where in modern times, we have a blend of both. Um, and so we will see this, though, come up time again when we also do other cross-cultural comparisons. Okay. So those are some of the classic problems. As I said, I did want to mention one Otham understanding of these processes. This comes from a past professor here. Unfortunately, he passed a few years ago, Um, trying to remember his last name. Camillus Lopez, and he's an elder. A lot of his philosophy came out of his dreams, and he had the fortune of writing them down and whatnot. He taught here at TOCC, but I want to make something very clear. Okay, one thing about Tana Otham and Native Americans as a whole is that there can be several ways of interpreting these things, even within one nation. Okay, so please don't think this represents all of Otham's thought. This is just one elder's interpretation. Okay, what he's going to say from the stories of the creation stories and the stories of, for example, the Bon, the coyote, and those kinds of things, is he's going to come to the conclusion of what's known as a duplicity of life, that individuals have the potential to do both good and evil. Okay. And he's going to take this from the story of the Bon, in English, it's coyote, right? Is that he's going to say that the coyote is a very devious species. It likes getting things riled up. It's kind of in a lot of ways a trickster in some aspects. But when a community is in trouble, it also becomes a helper for that community. So it has this duplicity, according to Camillus. Okay. And so he took that example of what he understood about the coyote and said, this is kind of our nature. We both can be devious and we can be good when we need to be good. Okay. He's going to argue that we actually have three aspects to the individual, or what he would call the true self. When we get into humanistic theory, we'll talk about, in a Western perspective, what the true self is. Okay. Were you telling me? Yeah. Okay. Anyways, uh, he's going to argue that there's three aspects, that we have the physical body, okay, and we have the mind. And these two things are tied together. Okay. The mind is the things that we needed to experience to survive in our physical world. Okay. But he's going to argue so that when the physical body dies, the mind dies as well, because you no longer need that knowledge to exist. But there is something he calls the soul and spirit that supersedes the physical aspects of the body and the mind. Okay. And so, and he used, and I won't get into them. He used many of the ceremonies and whatnot the Otham people use when someone passes away as an example that there has to be this separation of these two things, because we celebrate both still the mind as a person was here, but also they're leaving in a sense. Um, so, so that's one philosophy that we can see that tried to deal with these problems. My purpose in presenting in this is all societies tend to have a philosophy like this to try and explain our nature. Okay. So it's something that you'll all explore. Let's see what time it is. All right. Let's leave these for next time, because I'd rather present them all together. It should only take about half of a class, but we only have 15 minutes. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'll stop the recording. Just so you know, what we have left is we have some of the theories that were developed after Wilhelm Wundt and during William James' time, to try and explain human nature. We'll see how psychology really is a response to cultural movements in the way we interpret things. And then we'll get into our conversation about defining what culture is. I keep throwing that word out there. What is it, right? So I'm going to stop sharing.